Thank you, and many thanks to the Pan-Pontian Federation for inviting myself and Professor Zeevi. During the past decade, Professor Zeevi and myself closely studied the state papers of Turkey, Britain, France, and the United States, and the records of missionaries, mainly Americans, from 1894 until 1924. During those years, the Western powers, especially the United States, had dozens of diplomats stationed in various parts of Turkey, and dozens of missionaries lived and worked around the country. Similarly, Germany had diplomats and missionaries stationed around Turkey, and we have gone over a great deal of German material, as well as some Greek materials. Our conclusion after 9 years of research and analysis is that the three successive Turkish regimes, the Ottoman regime under Abdul Hamid II before World War I, the Young Turks or the CUP regime during World War I, and Ataturk's nationalist regime during 1919-1924, all adopted and implemented a policy geared to ridding Turkey of its Christian inhabitants. Despite the thorough purge of the Turkish archives, it is clear from reports from the provinces that the Turkish governors and military were acting on orders from Constantinople during these three periods. Between 1894 and 1924, Turkey's Muslim rulers destroyed the Christian communities of Asia Minor, Eastern Thrace, and the Urmia district of Persia, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, or Syriacs, in a staggered campaign of mass murder, expulsion, mass rape, and abduction of women and children, and forced conversion to Islam. The campaign enjoyed mass support among the Muslim population and was carried out by Turkish soldiers, policemen, and civilians, and by their helpers, chiefly Kurdish tribesmen, but also Circassians, Chechens, and Arabs. In the 19th century, about 20% of the population of Asia Minor was Christian, and on the eve of World War I, the Christians probably numbered about 4 million. By 1924, less than 2% of Asia Minor's population was Christian, and today, incidentally, 99.8% of Turkey's population is Muslim, 99.8%. Armenians claim that between 1 and 1.5 million Armenians were murdered in 1915-1916. Modern scholarship has tended to reduce this number to between 600,000 and 800,000. But another 200,000 died earlier, during 1894, 1896, and some 25,000 in 1909, and tens of thousands more were killed during 1919-1924. So for the whole period 1894-1924, the number of Armenians murdered is around 1 million or more. Greek historians have put the number of Greeks killed during 1894-1924 at around 1.5 million, perhaps a bit less. There's no way of ascertaining the true number, but certainly hundreds of thousands of Greeks were murdered by the Turks. Even pro-Turkish academics, such as Justin McCarthy, admit this, that hundreds of thousands were murdered, as well as at least 250,000 Assyrians. We've concluded that something like 2 million Christians, perhaps slightly more, were slaughtered by the Turks during 1894-1924, and about 2 million were expelled, 1.3 million of them reaching Greece. Moreover, the Muslim Turks destroyed the social, economic, and cultural religious infrastructure of these communities. Almost all Christian homes in thousands of towns and villages were destroyed or taken over by Muslims, and all churches were leveled, save for a few dozen that were converted to mosques. The Turkish rulers during the 19th century came to hate their Armenian subjects. Since its inception, the Ottoman Empire had allowed Christians to live in its territory, but on condition of political and social subservience. In the eastern marchlands, the Armenian peasantry lived in a state of vassaldom, paying tribute to sedentary and roving Kurdish tribes and massive bribes and taxes to local officials. But the opening up of the empire to the west, including commerce and education, the winds of liberation and nationalism which began to affect the Turks and Arabs also affected the urban Armenians and to a lesser degree the Greeks of Asia Minor. The Muslim Turks regarded the urban Armenians' increasing prosperity and demands for equality as a threat to their social and political supremacy, and the Armenians' demand for greater freedom and even autonomy, when coupled with Western and Russian diplomatic interventions and occasional military interventions, all of these jeopardized the empire's territorial integrity as the Turks saw it, and the empire's political stability. In the late 19th century, the rise of Armenian political parties and occasional Armenian terrorism underlined the perceived multiple threat in Turkish eyes. The Hamidian regime responded in 1894-1896 with massive anti-Armenian pogroms, which failed to elicit any foreign military intervention. Against the backdrop of World War I and exploiting the fog and exigencies of war, the CUP decided to finish with the Armenian problem once and for all, and began to eradicate the Greek and Assyrian problems as well. Armenians were rounded up from almost every area of the country and sent on endless death marches. In 1914-1915, young able-bodied men were disarmed and then either murdered on the spot or consigned to military labor battalions where they died a slow death. Women and children and the old were sent southeastwards towards the Syrian deserts around Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. Most died along the route. Most of those who survived the deportations were murdered systematically in 1916 in a second bout of mass murder along the Euphrates. In early 1914, the Turkish government initiated a campaign of deportation and exile vis-à-vis the Greeks living in the Aegean and, to a lesser extent, Greeks living elsewhere in Asia Minor. The government, using the CUP's local agents and gendarmerie, employed a variety of covert tactics, including economic boycott and low-level violence, to harass the Greeks into flight. Dozens were killed, and some 150,000 fled to Greece. This is during the first 6 months of 1914, before the eruption of World War I. During the subsequent World War, the Turks brutally deported inland or to Greece, which stayed out of the conflict until June 1917, hundreds of thousands more Greeks. Many thousands died in these deportations inland, which were designed to send these deportees to Muslim villages and towns. They died from shootings, beatings, dehydration, exhaustion, and disease. But the CUP refrained from systematic mass murder during World War I, as they had done with the Armenians, because they feared that this would force Greece to join the Allies. In the east, Turkish troops and gendarmes, assisted by Kurds, killed or drove out the Assyrians from the Hakkari region and Urmia in Persia. During 1919-1924, the nationalists who under Ataturk gradually took over Turkey, while engaged in wars against Russia and Armenia in the east, Greek invaders in the west, and French occupation forces in the south, embarked on massive campaigns of ethnic cleansing to finally rid the country of its Christians. The remaining Armenians, reinforced by more than 100,000 who had survived the 1915-1916 deportations and had returned to Turkey, were rounded up and deported or redeported southwards to French-held Syria or Greece. Some were massacred, as in Marash, in January-February 1920. But the major nationalist effort of ethnic religious cleansing was directed against Anatolia's Greeks. In the course of 1919-1924, following the Greek army's occupation of Smyrna in May 1919 and the start of the Greco-Turkish War, the Turks systematically massacred and drove out the Greeks. Adult males were mostly executed after being taken out of towns, and the Turks, and women and children, Armenian style, were sent on endless death marches inland. In 1922, the Turks changed tactics and began to drive Greeks from the interior to the ports on the Black Sea and Mediterranean and to exile in Greece. The ejection of the Greeks was completed after the signing of the Greek-Turkish Exchange of Population Agreement in January 1923. The agreement was implemented from October 1923 until 1925, and altogether about 189,000 Greeks and 350,000 Muslims were exchanged in this exchange agreement's implementation. Before then, of course, more than 1 million Greeks had been expelled and hundreds of thousands murdered. All three stages of the anti-Christian genocide were accompanied by mass rape and mass conversion. Rape was often followed by murder, but tens of thousands of Christian women and children, boys and girls, were abducted into Muslim households, Turkish, Kurdish, and Arab, and converted to Islam. During World War I, slave markets were set up in Aleppo and in other towns where Turks and Arabs bought and sold Christian girls and women. The three stages of the genocide and religious ethnic cleansing were linked. All three were driven by anti-Christian, anti-infidel passions and carried out as a jihad declared and egged on by the Muslim priesthood. The later avowed secularist, Ataturk, also enjoined his followers to slaughter and deport the Christians as part of a jihad. Particular prominent victims of the violence were Christian priests and pastors, as we've recently heard, who were in all three bouts of violence routinely tortured, murdered, and even crucified, while their churches were turned into latrines or stables before destruction or conversion to mosques. Christian graveyards were invariably desecrated. Tens of thousands of Christians were forced to convert to Islam. Hundreds and perhaps thousands preferred death, and there is endless testimony of women throwing themselves and their children into the Euphrates rather than face rape and conversion. 1894-1896 paved the way for 1915-1916 in various ways. And here I'm in a sense arguing against those who maintain that the Hamidian massacres of 1894-96 weren't part of this genocidal process. Those first bouts of massacre paved the way for 1915-16 in various ways, as 1915-1916 paved the way for 1919-1923. Each bout physically and psychologically prepared rulers and ruled, and the victims, for what was to follow. Each bout demonstrated what was possible. Methods, too, were honed, as the murderous deportations of 1915 were emulated in the murderous deportations of 1920-1923. And the earlier bouts demonstrated for the later perpetrators that it could be done with impunity. The foreign powers would do nothing to save the Christians. Why did the three regimes and their Muslim populations pursue de-Christianization? And that's actually what happened, de-Christianization of Turkey. Well, I've sort of listed the reasons, the causes for what happened, more or less in the order which we think is important. Firstly, the Christian minorities, especially the Armenians, were seen as a socio-economic and political threat to Muslim supremacy and the integrity of the state. There was a knife-in-the-back syndrome against the backdrop of a steadily geographically diminishing and weakening empire. 2, Islam, the obligation to fight and kill the infidel, the enemy of Allah and Islam, and the threat to Islam constantly were invoked, which is why often softas, that is religious seminarians and clerics, led the pogroms, as in Istanbul in 1895. In most Western reports on the various massacres, in all three bouts, Islam is said to be the driving force among the actual perpetrators. I'm not saying among those who organized what was happening, but among the killers, Islam was a driving force, a driving motivation for most of them, as reported in the documentation. A third factor is the rise of nationalism, and here I'm talking not only about Turkish nationalism, the rise of Turkish nationalism, which was of course displayed in this phrase, Turkey for the Turks, but also the rise of Armenian and Greek nationalism and the megali idea, the idea by Greeks of expanding the Greek state to include parts of Turkey, maybe even Constantinople, resurrecting, if you like, the Byzantine Empire. All of these contributed to the genocide. In other words, the Christian nationalisms contributed to the Turkish nationalism and the sense of threat among Turks, which led, of course, in part to the genocide. A fourth factor is certainly economic gain. Not that much energy has been devoted to the study of this, but the economic gain on two levels, on the national level and on the local level, was certainly a driving force in the whole process of genocide during these 30 years. Individuals who took part in pogroms wanted to benefit, to loot the possessions, the lands, the houses, other property of those they looted, of their neighbors. This is on the individual level, an economic factor, but also on the national level. People like Ataturk, the CUP leaders before him, understood that if you plunder Christian property, the state will gain a lot of money, a lot of assets, with which it can finance the wars which they were busy waging. So they needed a boost to the national economy as well. So both on the national and the individual level, economic gain was a driving force in the bouts of genocide. There's also in addition to these reasons I've mentioned, there's also the idea of revenge, and that's very important. The Turks, the Muslim Turks, felt that they had been mistreated, badly treated in the Balkans. Many of their families had been driven into exile, in other words, exiled to Turkey, where they arrived as muhajirs. This included, incidentally, a lot of the CUP leaders who originated in the Balkans, Saloniki and other places like Ataturk. And they wanted to take revenge for what had happened to their relatives and their communities in the Balkans at the hands of Christians, as they saw it. A last element which we single out as a cause for what happened is sexual gratification, in which tens of thousands, literally tens of thousands of cases of rape occurred in each of these bouts of mass murder, alongside each of these bouts of mass murder, in which women were raped and eventually turned into concubines and wives and so on. This was certainly on the individual level a driving force among the perpetrators, and one can also find traces of government interest in this happening, so that this would ultimately reduce the number of Christians in the empire and then in the state, and add to the number of Muslims in the state. So in other words, we didn't discover, for example, any case of any Muslim being tried for rape in the whole 30-year period, when we're talking about tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 cases of rape over this 30-year period. Nobody's ever tried for this. And this seems to indicate also that the state was interested in this, as I say, for demographic reasons. In the conclusion in our book, we devoted a few pages to comparing what happened in Turkey during these 30 years to what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust. And I think it's of interest also in highlighting various aspects of the Turkish genocide. Well, in the comparison, both the Germans during World War II and the Turks during World War I and even during the Ataturk period as well, utilized the fog of war and the passions triggered by war to commit genocide. This is a common factor both in the Holocaust and in what happened here. Secondly, common is that they were state organized. That is, the bouts of genocide here and the genocide by the Germans against the Jews were state-organized. They weren't spontaneous eruptions like some pogrom in some village in Poland in the 14th century. A major difference is the role of civilians. In the German Holocaust, that is the Holocaust of the Jews, civilians didn't take part. That is, German civilians. German civilians did not kill their neighbors, their Jewish neighbors. They may have seen them being carted off somewhere, which maybe eventually they learned was Auschwitz, but they didn't participate in any way in killing them. In Turkey, tens of thousands and perhaps hundreds of thousands of Turks, we can't really assess the number, participated in actual pogroms, in helping along the convoys, in robbing and killing the convoys in 1915 as they proceeded southwards. And the same applies during the guerrilla war, which essentially, that's what it was, in Ataturk's days. Civilians took a major part alongside soldiers, gendarmes, policemen, but not in the German case. In both cases, we find the main perpetrators, the main perpetrating nation, using auxiliaries to carry out the mass murder. The Germans used Ukrainians, Dutchmen, Frenchmen, Latvians to help their troops kill Jews, round up Jews, kill Jews, and the same applied with the Turks here. They used Kurds, they used Chechens, they used Arabs to kill off Christians. In both cases, there was a special organization which in some way spearheaded, or at least set in motion, the mass killing. The Germans had Einsatzgruppen, sort of special SS units which shot people. Eventually, they changed course and they started killing people with gas chambers and so on. But there were these special units dedicated to killing people. In the case of the Turks, there was the special organization, which also in some way led the mass murder in the East during 1915-16. In the German case, we're talking about mass murder by one regime. Though it's more than a few years, it lasted from 1933 to 45. The regime and the mass murder, say, lasted from 1940, thank you, lasted from 41 to 45. That was the period of the actual genocide. But it was one regime which did it, and you can say it was an aberration in German history. Not that there weren't pogroms in Germany in the 13th or 14th century, but it was an aberration in modern German history, what the Nazi regime did to the Jews. In the case of the Turks, we're talking about 3 regimes over a 30-year period. So it can't really be considered an aberration in modern Turkish history. This was Turkish policy during those 3 regimes during a 30-year period. Both the Germans and the Turks used deception vis-a-vis the actual victim populations. In other words, we're transporting you eastward to resettle you. We're not actually sending you to die. Both regimes did that, and deception vis-a-vis the Western powers or Russia, trying to hide, for example, the murders by covering them in lime or burying them under the earth. But they tried to deceive and to hide what they were doing, both regimes knowing that they were, of course, committing something criminal. In both cases, the victims went like sheep to the slaughter. I'm talking about here the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Assyrians. There were places where there was some resistance. There was Musadag, there was Van, there was Zeytun, where Armenians resisted. But essentially, they went like sheep to the slaughter, just like the Jews went like sheep to the slaughter in Europe during World War II, except for a few exceptional cases, Warsaw Ghetto and so on, where there was a revolt. Treblinka, there was a revolt, but these are rare. Essentially, they all went like sheep to the slaughter. There's various reasons for it, but I won't go into it. But there is a commonality in the two types, experiences of genocide. One last thing I'd want to mention is that there was little dissidence, there was little resistance among the people of the killing nation to what was happening. It's not that there weren't protests here and there. We know in Trebizond, which my drawer will talk about soon, there were some people who protested against what the Turks were doing to the Greeks in 1922. There were even some governors who resigned or refused to carry out orders or tried to postpone implementation of a deportation or execution orders, but generally everybody went along with what was happening in the bureaucracies and among the population. And the same applies to Germany. There were rare cases in Germany where there was dissent, but people essentially carried out orders and did the job. One last thing I'd mention, and this is something which Dror might not agree with me about and isn't included explicitly in the book's conclusion, but that is that what happened here in Turkey during this 30-year period was, in my view, part of the fourth wave of conflict between the Christian West and the East, the Muslim East, if you like, part of the fourth wave of jihad by the Muslim East against the Christian Western world. There were four waves in history of jihad. There was the first, of course, wave when Islam arose in the 7th and 8th centuries and swept across North Africa, the Middle East, even southern Europe in some parts. That was the first wave. The second wave of jihad, which was certainly defensive, was against the Crusaders who'd moved into the Holy Land, reconquered or conquered the Holy Land. That ignited a second wave of jihad by the Muslim East against the Christendom. There was a third wave, which was when the Ottoman Empire expanded, or the Ottomans expanded, conquering Byzantium, Constantinople, and then tried to conquer Vienna, Budapest. That was the fourth wave, 15th, 17th centuries. And I think we're now in the fourth wave of mass conflict between the Muslim East and the Christian West. This, if you like, a fourth wave of jihad. Many jihadis will tell you it's a defensive jihad. They're protecting themselves against Western incursion, economic, political, military, but it is a wave of jihad which you can say begins more or less in the 1860 pogroms in Lebanon and Syria, continues, if you like, in the struggle against the Western presence in the Middle East, which is the Zionist enterprise, Israel, 1948. But also, in the midst of this, you've got the attacks on the Christians attacks and genocide against the Christians in the Ottoman Empire, especially in Turkey, before, during, and after World War II. And today, of course, this fourth wave is continued by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on. That's what I wanted to say. Please.